In response to one of my most recent videos, the one about transracialism and how that compares to transgenders, one of my viewers and fellow YouTubers, Middleman, decided to reach out to me to have a conversation about the postmodern breakdown of cultural and gender norms, some of the internal contradictions of identity politics, and we got a little bit into UBI and some other topics. Hope you enjoy. You mentioned that you don't like postmodernism.
Yeah, personally.
Can you elaborate about that?
I'm kind of on both sides. I do highly appreciate it, and there are certain things that I really enjoy it for. I love art. I'm an artist, a musician. I'm just all over the place. I love artistic, creative expression, and in that category, fucking postmodernist ideas are phenomenal. You know. It's just when those ideas are applied to, ideas in politics, for instance, or governing, or class identity, or things like that. That's when I'm not a fan of it. And I think after the little bit of looking into this topic, I think the opinion that I have so far is that I think I would be on board if postmodernists were totally on board or totally not, So if the same sort of postmodern ideas about deconstructing socially constructed identity, aspects of identities, like race, like sex, like gender, like class or whatever, if postmodernists were happy to apply that postmodern dissection to everything, I think I could be pretty happy with it. I just find it interesting that at this point in time, race isn't being deconstructed in the same way as sex is. So that's the thing I'm kind of interested in, But I'm not necessarily for or against postmodernism. It's like a tool. In some places it's great. In some places I feel like it doesn't get the job done,
Yeah, there seems to be an inconsistency there. One of the main things is that the supposed progressive left is not, in my opinion, actually left at all. I think there's some people who are actually class, racial, gender abolitionists, and I include myself into that category. But as I talked about in my video, I don't believe that everybody who calls themselves progressive are actually that. Some of them, I think, are just pro-black or pro-whatever and just want to keep their own culture for themselves. Basically, the black equivalent of a white ethno-state,
Sure.
Damn racists should stick to themselves,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that makes it frustrating is the left, or what's supposed to be the left, sends a bunch of mixed signals. Mm-hmm. Because we have some people who are actually for racial and gender progress, and there's some people who are just advancing an agenda. And they just seem to line up. So that lets the alt-right come in and say, oh, look at the left. They're all messed up. They're all confused. You can never satisfy them. Come to us. We'll be racist, but we'll be for white people and always for white people, and nobody will be confused now.
Or at least we'll be consistent. You'll know what you're getting. I'm a Canadian, so I'm not as involved in American politics as a lot of the videos that I watch. But when the 2016 election was coming up, I had this, not a prediction, but I had this feeling that one of the things that the liberal sort of progressive left narrative was providing people was this really weird sort of version of the American dream that on one hand said, you can be anything you want, you can do anything you want, you can identify as anything as you want, up is down, left is right, it's up to you, your experience is the only thing that will determine how others judge you, and then simultaneously essentially prove to people that whatever you pick, you're wrong and you will be ridiculed. And I felt like that maybe created this kind of chaotic existence where people are like, you know what, just give me a tyrant who will lay the rules out. I just want to know what the rules are so I can play the game. I don't know if you ever read Calvin and Hobbes, but they have this game called Calvin Ball where you can make up whatever rule you want, and the only rule is you can't use the same rule twice. So it's like, it's pure chaos, right? Like, no one wants to play a game like that. People want to know what the rules are, so you don't work really hard for 5 years and then find out it was all for nothing. And I felt like that's a little bit of the sense that I was getting on the sort of progressive left side of the narrative, where it's like, anything is whatever you want it to be, but and we won't set down any real rules. And I feel like maybe some of the people that were voting for Trump back then were reacting to that kind of like, I'd rather have some, whether it's racist or sexist or some sort of horrible system, but at least it's concrete and it's set. Did you sort of sense any of that?
That actually just reminds me of something. You know how all these different franchises for different corporations are just changing things around? For example, Trader Joe's. They used to call something Trader Ming's because it's based on Asian food. At the time that they put in that name, it was meant from a place of cultural authenticity, They meant to be respectful. Mm-hmm. But then some of these people, they're saying, oh no, that's cultural appropriation, or that's racist to use the word Ming somehow. So they fall into the trap that everybody falls into. Basically, they judge others by their actual deeds and actions, while they judge themselves by their intentions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I was watching a clip earlier today, and it was of some woman that, was changing the pigment of her skin. She was being interviewed, and the host said, you can't just expect to change the color of your skin and be black, because being black is about generations of suffering. And it almost made it sound like it doesn't even matter if she suffered, because being black is largely defined as being the inheritor of generations of relatives that suffered in some way. I find that really interesting, because if we're going to define something like blackness based on oppression, then guess what? I have white-looking skin, but my grandparents were slaves in a gulag. And going further back in my ancestry, I'm a Slav. That means slave. I've got slavery in my family 2 generations ago. I wouldn't call myself black because my grandparents were slaves. That seems ridiculous. And it seems equally ridiculous to me that someone who wasn't themselves enslaved, that may or may not have had relatives that were enslaved, would fundamentally define their identity on that and not as something like actual skin color. I just find it really confusing. So are we judging the individual for the characteristics that the individual has? And like you said, whether it is the intentions or the actions of the individual, or are we judging the individual based on the actions of their ancestors? If someone had ancestors that if my dad was a murderer or something, do I get judged for his actions? Because in general, I feel like we live in a society where we don't hold people accountable to what their relatives did. If I had no control over it, then why should I be responsible for that? With race, often with sex, one of the arguments that I hear sometimes for women is even if women now are thriving in post-secondary institutions, college and university enrollment is more female than male. If middle-aged women are out earning men, even hypothetically, if those things are true, the argument can often be that, but historically, they've suffered so much that who these individuals are now is irrelevant. What's relevant is the historical context.
I reject any sort of historical argument. I think inherited sin is a bullshit concept. I don't know who started it. Okay, I have some idea who started it. It was the Jews. I mean, they started the Adam and Eve ate the apple, and then everybody is sinful from now on. Getting back to the ancestry, if you go back far enough in anybody's ancestry, you're gonna find someone who's used his own boot to step on the head of someone else, and you're gonna find an ancestor who was the person being stepped on. I mean, if you look far enough into the past, basically it all evens out, and at that point everything becomes meaningless. I mean, you can talk about epigenetics, which is the changing of genes from one generation to the next based on something that happened in your lifetime, but clearly black people aren't talking about epigenetics when they're talking about historical trauma or anything like that.
Yeah.
They're just talking about, we're in this bad place because something bad happened to our ancestors in the past. I don't really accept that argument, because let's say we have a black person whose grandfather was a slave, and because of that, this person is rolling around in the dirt in poverty.
Yeah.
All right, so we could say that it's a direct result of slavery, and we might want to ameliorate that. But let's say we have a white person who's just as poor, but instead of having a grandfather who was a slave, let's say their parents were rich, but they were also gamblers, and they gambled all their money away. If in this situation, both people, white or black, are in the same situation, it doesn't really matter what their ancestors did or had something done to them. It makes no logical sense that anybody should be held accountable for anything that happened to or happened by their ancestors. Inheritance in a general, from money when somebody dies, like that also has never made sense to me.
Yeah, it reminds me of increasing talk about implementing universal basic incomes. You know, when Andrew Yang was running, that was his main platform. I see it popping up over and over. I wonder what would happen in terms of political narratives if we were to see the following. Universal basic income comes into existence, right? So everyone, let's say in the United States, is getting $2,000 a month. Now,
Oh, that's a bit ambitious, isn't it?
sure.
We are getting $1,200, a one-time payment.
Oh, fuck. I'm just saying, hypothetically, for the sake of the thought experiment, if there was a situation where everyone was getting an equal amount, and let's say over the course of a year, some individuals of their own free will, because we're acknowledging that people have free will, I hope, right? Some people of their own free will, they paid the rent, but they spent the excess on junk food, booze, buying some weed, whatever. And some individuals, maybe a minority, maybe 10% of the population, they saved all that money. And after a year, all of a sudden, this new class system emerges where 10% of the population, for some fucked up reason, have $5,000 saved up, and no one else does. I'm really curious how that would play out in the socio-political narrative, whether people would acknowledge that this $5,000 came from the same place that essentially everybody else's lack of $5,000 came from, or if those people would be accused of having some unfair systemic quality that was essentially depriving everyone else of having, because once you have $5,000, even $2,000, you could buy a precision tool, you could buy a vehicle, you could buy something that will become an economic multiplier for you. You can become more successful, if you save up your money and you buy something with it. Take it even further. After 10 years, those 10% of people who have been saving and working hard, they are now the producers of all the goods that other 90% is consuming. And if those 90% complain that they don't have any capital to play with, if everyone is given the same amount equally, is it still one group's fault for being more responsible with it? I'm really curious. I was reminded of this when you were saying, the achievements of any individual who, let's say, starts off broke, right? It's I feel like in some ways we're already in that situation where it's pretty fucking hard to do the diligent type of analysis that's required to truly understand whether an individual has privilege, let's say they have money and a car and a house and whatever. It's so difficult to be able to calculate whether they have that because of hard work or because of luck or because of social networking or because of some systemic racism. And I find that for the people that often don't have those things, it's really easy to accuse the people that have it with the worst possible narrative of how they got there. It's oh yeah, he's rich. Of course, probably he got there by stepping on people's heads, backstabbing people. I'm curious how those narratives, I'm curious what type of new class system would emerge in a society where everyone had access to UBI. You can only blame yourself really, rationally if you were to look at it. But I'm really curious what kind of narratives people would come up with. Would some people have patience, privilege, tenacity? I don't know. What would become a characteristic that you could discriminate against people for that gave them this unfair advantage, of not spending their money on entertainment?
So I'm hearing you talk about UBI, and I think basically what's happening is you're making a comparison between the $2,000 a month UBI versus what we have now, at least in the United States, which is zero. You're making the comparison that both systems contain UBI, except our UBI is $0 in America, where it might be $2,000 somewhere else. Class inequality, at least in terms of wealth, isn't necessarily bad. It's bad when, one, someone's rigging the system. America is basically a corporatocracy. I mean, all our tax money goes to bailing out corporations. UBI's purpose is not necessarily to redistribute wealth or make everything more equal. It's, one, to make sure that people don't starve on the streets and die, that they have their basic needs met. And the second thing is as economic stimulus.
For sure.
Basically, the theory goes not that people will necessarily become successful or that the wealth will flatten out, because, I mean, Jeff Bezos, I mean, he's making $13 billion a day. A UBI won't really make a dent in that way too much. As UBI goes, it's probably more of an economic stimulus, as in you have another $2,000 to spend. The hope is that people will use that to take risks, invest in their own small businesses. So it's more of an economic stimulus thing that gives people more opportunity, rather than trying to directly impact the wealth inequality.
How do you feel about the impact that UBI would have on government staff? Like, one of the things that I really like about the idea of UBI is, right now, let's say where I am in Canada, if you want to go get social assistance, there is a vetting process. You need to be interviewed by people. They need to check up on you. You need to be looking for a job. It takes a lot of human resources to stay on top of and monitor all the people that are receiving social assistance to make sure that they're genuinely eligible, that they're not trying to game the system. So one of the things I really like about UBI is the potential to just remove that whole chunk of government. Be like, you know what, we don't need to worry about who's worthy or unworthy, because everyone just gets the same thing. It doesn't need to be moderated as heavily. Then on the flip side, this potentially leads to a lot of job losses in the government sector of people that had these jobs previously. Do you have any opinions on that? Or
if you're saying that we could cut out some unnecessary government process, the jobs part isn't what we should really worry about, because by your argument, the jobs are just fulfilling a task that's completely pointless anyway. So you might as well just make them go and build a bridge or something like that. So like, jobs can be artificially created. You'll still need some sort of administration to make sure everybody gets their UBI.
And that people don't get double or something like that. No, I like the economic stimulus part. What I was speaking about earlier, I was thinking about that thought experiment as an analogy for, like you were saying, it hypothetically having 2,000 versus what you have now, which is 0. And I guess my analogy was like, what you have now, what almost every free first world nation has now, is opportunity. So sure, right now no one's handing out money, but the opportunity, as I see it, maybe I'm a deluded optimist, but it seems to me like the opportunity is pretty equal if you want to go out there and contribute and make yourself indisposable to someone, to an employer. It's like, the opportunity is there for you to rise through the ranks and become successful, you know? Like when I owned a business, I owned a bar for 6 years. Out of all the employees that I had over those 6 years, 2 out of a total of maybe, 35, I had 2 employees that were so far above the level of conscientiousness of all the other employees. Until I hired the first one, this guy Brian, I had no idea how good an employee could be. And once he started working for me, within a week, I was like, you're the manager. And it was the first time, this was years after having already been operating the business, I was like, holy fuck, if I can get like 10 more Brians, I could start franchising. I could open up multiple locations. But up until that time, I had such poor quality employees compared to this guy. He wasn't even doing anything crazy. He was just working as hard as I was. He just treated the business like wanted to see it succeed, as opposed to like a place where he just shows up to like collect a paycheck. But yeah, I was blown away by, after the fact, realizing how rare it is to find an employee that actually gives a shit, you know? And for me, and I was only a small business owner, so I can understand probably there's an argument that, larger corporations are just so faceless and, they don't recognize talent. They don't recognize hard work at the bottom because human resources is so far removed or something. But from my personal experience, while I had that bar, anyone that came to me that put in sincere effort, I would have immediately elevated to as high of a position as I could have, and then I would have been in a position to open up a new location and make them in charge of that location, Again, it might be a grossly optimistic opinion of the state of things, but I kind of see things as being very rich in opportunity for everyone. And like, I didn't discriminate against men or women or people of color or what, it's just like, I see people as people. Now, if there are large chunks of Canada and the States that I'm not familiar with, where racism is like a really real thing or sexism is a real thing, then I'm mistaken. But the way I see things so far is that the opportunity is out there. As with the UBI thought experiment, some people will take advantage of that opportunity and some people won't. And then when you fast forward in one of those systems, 10 years or something, you end up with a bunch of people who actually have some amazing things to show for their hard work and diligence, and then then you got all the rest of the people who don't have anything. How do those people justify their own lack of success, you know?
I think one of the things is you mentioned that only 2 of the 35 employees that you actually employed were any good. That's actually a very small number if you look at it.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned about the general welfare of people. And sure, some people may not be trying that hard. Some people may just be untalented or mentally incapable of putting their all into something that they're not passionate about. What do we do about those people? We could argue that if they just really worked harder, which some people actually, I would argue that most people can't do. Most people are procrastinators. What are we going to do? Are we going to let them starve? So I don't know what it's like in Canada. I imagine it's some sort of like wondrous fantasy land where everybody has their needs met.
Have you ever thought about moving somewhere, like moving to another country?
Oh yeah, I've definitely thought about it.
Yeah, it might be time, depending on how much worse things get, you know? Yeah, healthcare, I understand, is one of my friends was telling me the other day, when she used to live in the States, she had a kid, and apparently, I didn't know this about babies, but apparently when babies are young, they're just constantly getting mild infections. You know, they're new to the world. They're getting exposed to stuff. So your baby will regularly get fevers. And it's like, do you take them to the hospital or do you wait to see if they get through it? And she said that she would go to the hospital and she would sit outside the hospital with her baby with a thermometer, just checking every half hour, hoping that the baby just gets better on its own. And, you know, usually they do, but as a mother also, you're really just fucking concerned, right? Because for her, just going into the hospital would be like, immediately, that's like $800 thing just to get looked at, you know? I gotta admit, not having those types of concerns here, how do you even translate that to some sort of an economic value? That amount of stress savings, I'm sure that translates to the overall productivity of an individual, you know, in terms of how they contribute to society, in terms of how well they're able to generate an income that can be taxed, again, for the well-being of, I was in Arizona 2 years ago, and my friend's car got buried. These desert people came out to save us. They towed us out. This one guy let us store my friend's car on his property, and he had this hole in his foot. It was all bandaged up. We couldn't tell it was a hole at first. We're like, hey, what happened to your foot? And he's like, I was unhooking the hitch or whatever on my boat wheel carrier thing, and it fell, and an inch-thick rod just went through my foot. And we're like, holy fuck, like, are you okay? He's like, yeah, you know, it's been like a couple weeks. I'm just kind of seeing how it goes. We're like, have you been in the hospital? He's like, not yet. You know, I'll see how it goes. It's like he lived in this house. He owns the property. I think he pays like $200 in taxes a year for the property tax. Going to the hospital, he might as well buy a new fucking house. Like, oh, it's crazy, really, to think about it. But then I'm also curious, like, why don't people move? Are there other advantages? Are there other benefits? Or is it that procrastination that you mentioned, you know?
I think it's just like the stupid belief that the American dream is real. That's one thing. The other thing is some people are just like so poor they can't move. Money it traps us all, which is why like UBI, it could work, but also you might want to scale it down to the local level in some aspects as well, because people have different needs.
That's true.
Especially in a crack-ass system like America, where if you have asthma, that's cost you like a fortune just to stay alive. Different people have different needs and they'll take different amounts of money to support everybody. So UBI, I wouldn't say is by itself enough to sustain everybody.
Yeah, like ideally UBI would just be on top of whatever your basic needs are. UBI is the $2,000 that you spend on products or services or invest into riskier things. It's that economic stimulus. It doesn't go into just keeping you alive, right?
Oh yeah, and we do have a lot of racism around. A lot of it's more indirect than it used to be. I don't like to be the guy who just screams microaggressions at everything, because that's kind of like everybody just rolls their eyes when you mention that. But like some of it is as simple as, oh, those black folk, they always vote blue. They must be idiots, must be genetically inferior. But then you can't say that. So like it's difficult to tell whether some form of the racism that we have built into our system, and I'm not saying the system is inherently racist, but there's some aspects that are definitely built there for a reason, and it's to suppress black votes. I'm not sure whether it's because they actually hate black and brown people, or if they're just there to suppress the vote so that they can just win politically. But in either case, it's racially motivated. So yes, there is plenty of racism around here. I think it's a tool that a lot of conservatives use. They're just good at dog whistling out of the park so that people who aren't particularly perceptive can't like really tell.
from the way things look from where I am, it seems like race is such a powerful political tool, such a powerful tool of influence. I kind of feel like everyone's using it, and the strategies differ between the left wing and right wing sort of rhetoric. If we could define racism as simply as attributing characteristics to an individual presumed to be characteristics of a group of people, that kind of inaccuracies, like, oh, if statistically this group of people has a higher rate of committing crimes than this other group, then I will project that expectation onto any individual that identifies with that group, even though that individual might be a fucking officer of the peace. It's like, you remind me of the group, so I'm going to use the group's characteristics to judge you.
And it's also like the dog whistling that conservatives do to hide the fact that they're really just racist, or in some cases just neo-Nazis. That's one of the reasons why the progressives actually go and look at microaggressions and look at all that stuff, because we can't go and say anymore that people are outright racist just based on exactly what they're saying because, well, they're dog whistling. So we have to actually look and dig deeper and try to figure out their intentions. And basically at that point, the right wing just goes, nah, but that's not what I said. They can use the defense of, oh, I intended good things. Meanwhile, the left is trying to read everyone's minds, and it's never a good time.
You know, when people do systems analysis, they don't even need to interact with any individual. For instance, you look at the attendance, or let's say the graduation rates by race of a particular higher learning institution. And if they're not a completely equivalent reflection of the population, then you're like, well, look, there's all these people living in this area, but the only people in this school that are black, you know, they only represent a fraction of the people in that community. The only answer for this is racism, you know, where you just do systems analysis and come to that conclusion that way. That I think that could be a helpful tool in some situations. I think that it could become really dangerous. For instance, now, here anyways, most of the universities are now becoming predominantly female. I don't think the people who were excited to use those statistics when women only attributed 15 or 20% of women in university, when people were saying, well, this is systemic sexism and we need to make radical changes in our policies to get more women in here because it's unfair. Now it's 60% women. I'm pretty sure those people wouldn't want that same reasoning to be used to now do the opposite. It's a potentially dangerous tool.
I think intersectionality, it should remain a tool, though. It should not be an ideology as it is among some people who claim to be among the left, which, again, I consider them more like neo-segregationists. They're actually just secretly kind of racist in the other direction, or sexist in the other direction. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting double standard that prison sentences, they'll go on about how black people get longer sentences for the same crimes, and they do, and that's reflective of some sort of integrated racism, at least on the part of the judges, whether it be conscious or unconscious. But if you look at those same stats, it also tells us that if you're a woman, your chances of going to jail or going to prison or being imposed with like a harsh sentence, they're like cut in basically in half.
Yeah, this is kind of going back to the transracials. But there's an interesting binary in racism that is a black and white binary. People don't really generally talk about Asian populations, which, for instance, if you're Asian, you're further away from whites than whites are away from blacks in terms of economic success, quality of life, health, lifespan, all that stuff. There's this immense Asian privilege that people are ignorant of. People seem to focus on the sort of binary of black and white relations.
Because it's inconvenient.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as that. It's inconvenient to talk about Asians when you're so focused on white privilege. I mean, there's no other way to explain it. Okay, there's a few ways you could explain it. If you're actually trying to go through intersectionality, at least do it properly and at least look at how the Asians have done. And there are some explanations. The American immigration policy has only let Asians who are already successful migrate into America. And then we can have a discussion about whether that policy is racist or whatever it is.
Yeah, or classist or something. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. I read that some of your Ivy League schools have different admission standards for Asians, Caucasians, and blacks.
Yeah, affirmative action. And that goes back to the immigration, because on the one hand, you could say that the American immigration policies is actually racist against Asians, as in they only let you into the country if you're super rich or have something economically to benefit America. Therefore, you're being discriminated against and you should get a boost in the college rankings. But then that would make every college like almost completely Asian. The other way of looking at it is you were discriminated against by America's immigration policy, and then you came here and you were still successful, and now we're going to punish you for that. Like that, it seems like a double discrimination for being good enough to pass into our immigration policy. Like, it doesn't particularly make sense when you look specifically through the prism of oppressor and oppressed. Now, if you're looking purely about equality of outcome, or if you're looking about whose wealth is the highest and going based on that, then this problem is kind of solved in sort of a way.
It creates an interesting market after people have finished their time in a post-secondary institution. I mean, I don't know how I would feel, but I'm just trying to imagine someone who's in the position of like, you own a small software company and you need to hire new developers, and you're going to job fairs at universities. You're trying to hire straight out of the third year computer sciences program. At this point, if I was in that position, like, would it be racist of me to have higher expectations of the Asian students, knowing that things were harder for them, so that if they're still scoring high, they're not? That institution's skewed admission policy, if I'm not ignorant of it, then it wouldn't make sense for me not to take that into consideration. But then that's making me racist, essentially. Just for trying to pick the best candidate.
At that point, you may be adjusting for the adjustment. The college is adjusted for race to give black people an advantage, and at this point you're trying to adjust the adjustment to mitigate the discrimination that was earlier implemented by the colleges. But that actually falls into the trap of what the colleges are doing in the first place, because the colleges are trying to adjust for the discrimination that black people have faced in their life, and they have taken it upon themselves to try to fix things. So it goes on to an infinite loop where everybody's trying to make their tiny adjustments, and they're all focused on race. What my biggest criticism of an affirmative action isn't necessarily that it's logically incoherent, it's that if you apply this to anything else, it starts to break down. Like, you can talk about, okay, well, someone has disadvantages because they're black or they're brown or something like that. But then you can look at a bunch of different things, like maybe they had an abusive father, right? I'd much rather be black than have an abusive father. But then for some reason, we're focusing only on race as a determining factor, when we could be looking at all these different factors. I mean, basically, my test is the left-hand test. If you replaced black and white with left-handed and right-handed and it doesn't make sense, your policy probably doesn't make sense. Should we be treating people differently based on whether we have enough left-handed people in our college? If that doesn't make sense, we probably shouldn't really care that much about whether race, because there's like a million things we could adjust for, and race is one of the most arbitrary factors we could do it by.
Yeah, I agree. You know, it's one of the things that I really find fascinating about some of the potential uses for postmodernism. And again, why I find the transracial sort of postmodern thread so full of really interesting potential, like with the male-female dichotomy and discrimination between sex. Transsexualism, the ability for people to be recognized as whatever sex they choose to identify as, it's a really great counter to any potential sexism in the workplace, whether it's on behalf of the workplace itself. Like, I think I was reading a while ago that in California, you know, there was a new law where any corporation needed to have a certain amount of female executives, and any board of directors needed to be a certain percentage female. And so it's like, that's one of those laws that's similar to the thing with the schools, that kind of preferential treatment. But with the corporate situation, then potentially anyone who's male, who doesn't want to be discriminated against with this program, the sexist law, theoretically could respond to it with a postmodern take on personal identity and say, you know what, I'm a woman then, and now I can still have this position. It's an interesting way to negate that kind of systemic sexism that is trying to fix some other systemic sexism. It just sort of dissolves all of the meaning of all of those systems. It doesn't matter anymore. It'd be interesting if we started seeing similar things happen to race, where it's like no one would need to worry about race because we would literally not have a definition for it. You'd say, what's race? It's a social construct. What does the social construct mean it is? I don't know. I guess it has more to do with how much money you earn, how you feel in society, what you choose to do. If it just became this meaningless thing where it was up to the individual to decide, how would institutions like these Ivy League schools be able to pull off this sort of discrimination? If you were an Asian student, you could just say, I'm black. And then now you're getting in with the same whatever score, you know?
Yeah, you can't accept transgenders and also be discriminating people based on whether they're male or female CEOs. Those positions are mutually incompatible. And the fact that we're doing just that means basically one of two things. It means either people on the left just don't know what the fuck they're talking about, which I highly doubt. And the other option is that different people have different ideas of how things should go, and probably some of them aren't actually even leftists. Now, I would prefer that there be no discrimination at all. I mean, it's just like, there's not enough left-handed CEOs.
Yeah.
Let's make sure that we have some left-handed people. It doesn't make sense when it goes to any other prism, even though left-handed and right-handed are way more clearly defined than male and female are. And yet, for some reason, we choose to be stuck on this one particular thing.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'm really curious how much satisfaction, maybe satisfaction isn't the word I'm looking for, it's a little hard to articulate, but like if you're a trans woman, does coming out, does that accurately, succinctly fix things for you, make things feel good? Because, you know, if I'm not mistaken with gender dysphoria is like, look, I don't feel like I'm this person. I feel like I should be this other person. And a lot of that is related to the very sort of subjective cultural roles. People that were born in a man's body, they're like, look, the expectations that society has of me, of how to act, those feel alien. I don't feel like that. I feel like I should be expected to behave and look the way women do. That's what I identify with. So then when that individual becomes a trans woman, I'm really curious how fulfilling that transition is to that sense of how satisfying or how therapeutic, or, you know, I'm really curious how people in these positions, does it just fix things for them, you know? Do they? Because
I speculate that it does. I mean, psychological research shows that people in general being and acting fake, that just takes a huge psychological toll on them. So I would expect that pretending to be a man when in fact you feel more like a woman, I expect that just falls into the category, if nothing else, of simply being fake. Mm-hmm. And so I think that just by itself, coming out and being able to let go of all of those preconditions that are expected of you, I'd imagine it would feel good. And people who do end up transitioning, like most of them have higher life satisfaction and are less likely to commit suicide. All right, so before we wrap this up, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, for the time being, I'm into personality analysis. I'm into 5-factor model personality kind of stuff.
Are you into Jordan Peterson?
You know what? Like, there's a lot of really interesting information that he contributed to that field. And in general, at this point, he's kind of like one of those guys where, like, you know, he's so on the map, right? Like, it's kind of like Trump, you know, where it's like,
I could feel it from you.
Yeah.
I mean, he's one of the few people on the political right that have some semblance of intellectual honesty and that can be respected. I don't agree with almost all of his positions, but at least I can recognize that he's an intelligent man who thinks out his positions a lot.
He's really religious also, which is interesting. You know, I'm not a religious individual, but I'm fascinated with psychology, and I think that archetypes play a huge role in how we function, how we govern our behavior. And I think that religious icons, like whether they're gods or demons or holy individuals, those used to play a role for people that recently is replaced by superstars or political figures or actors and stuff like that.
Yeah,
but
I think black and white is an archetype. I think one of the reasons for racism is just that people associate black with bad and white with good. That's one of the simplest analyses that we could make. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's an interesting topic we could get to next time.
Yeah.
As for Jordan Peterson's religiosity, I'm going to do a Jordan Peterson myself and say it depends on what you mean by religious. I think he consciously knows there's not a God. He's like a Christian atheist. He respects Christian theology and doctrine and everything they say, but he doesn't necessarily believe in it. I think he's more like an atheist in that sort of sense.
Yeah, I think he believes in the value of how religion is interpreted and how it's put to work, as opposed to whether there's actually a cloudy ghost bearded guy, you know?
If you feel like you got something out of our conversation, go ahead and click the link hopefully in the description box below and help out a fellow content creator.
Thanks for the talk. I enjoyed it immensely.
Thank
and
you.
I'm looking forward to, we'll chat again real soon, hopefully.
I'm and I approve this message.